Would you believe a dog could sense something that even the most experienced doctors couldn't? Would you believe that a creature who cannot speak our language could somehow know when a fragile life was slipping away and find a way to hold on? Just long enough to change everything? If I told you a story about a little girl, her tired mother, a nurse who couldn't explain what she witnessed, and a loyal Labrador who refused to give up, would you stay until the very end? Because this isn't just about medicine or miracles. It's about the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. It all began in a quiet suburban town. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors waved from their porches. In that town lived a little girl named Ava. She was only 6 years old, with soft brown curls that framed her tiny face, big curious eyes that always seemed to be asking silent questions, and a laugh that could fill a room with sunshine. Before she got sick, she was the kind of child who collected wildflowers and gave them to strangers just to make them smile. She spent afternoons drawing with crayons, filling page after page with colorful dogs, castles, and hearts. And every single picture had one thing in common: a golden Labrador named Milo sitting right beside her. Because Milo wasn't just a family dog. He was her shadow, her protector, her very best friend. He came into her life when she was only 2, a rescue from the local shelter who was shy at first, but somehow connected with her instantly. From that moment on, wherever Ava went, Milo followed. If she was playing in the yard, he was lying next to her with his head on his paws. If she was eating breakfast, he was sitting quietly by her feet. If she cried in the middle of the night, he would nudge her hand gently until she smiled again. Ava's mother, Julia, used to joke that they didn't adopt Milo. Milo adopted Ava, and everyone in their family believed it was true. Life was simple, beautiful even, until one winter morning, when Ava woke up with a fever that wouldn't go away. At first it seemed like just the flu, but then the days turned into weeks, and no medicine made her better. Her tiny body grew weaker. Her energy faded. Her once bright laughter turned into quiet whispers. Julia took her to doctor after doctor, test after test, and still no clear answers came. Finally, she was admitted to the local hospital, a modest but well-kept building where the pediatric wing was small, but always full of soft beeping monitors and tired parents praying for good news. The room they gave Ava was at the very end of the hallway, near a large window that overlooked the parking lot and a small garden that volunteers tended every spring. Julia brought blankets from home, Ava's favorite stuffed bunny, and of course, she brought Milo. She couldn't bear to leave him alone, but hospital rules didn't allow dogs inside the ward. So Julia tied his leash to the bench just outside the entrance, and every single day Milo sat there from morning to night waiting, watching the sliding doors, his golden fur ruffled by the wind, his eyes never leaving the hallway where Ava's room was. Nurses passing by would sometimes stop to pet him, saying what a good boy, but Milo never wagged his tail unless Ava appeared. Even if only for a brief moment when Julia carried her to a wheelchair for tests, Milo would perk up, his entire body alive with quiet excitement, and then, when she disappeared behind those doors again, he would return to his stillness. Like a sentinel on duty among the nurses in that hospital was Clara, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a calm voice that made children feel safe. She had worked in pediatrics for over 20 years. She had seen miracles, heartbreak, and everything in between. But she had never seen a dog quite like Milo. She noticed how he never barked or whined for attention like most dogs would. He simply sat there, alert but patient. And when she learned he belonged to Ava, she began to pay closer attention. Because Ava's condition was complicated, her fever came and went without warning. Sometimes her oxygen levels dropped suddenly in the middle of the night, and no one could predict it. But one evening, Lara noticed something strange. It was late, past visiting hours. The hallways were dim. Only the faint glow of monitors lit the rooms. She was making her usual rounds when she heard it. A low, soft whine outside the door at the end of the hall. She glanced through the window and saw Milo, sitting up now, his body tense. Ears back slightly, eyes focused on Ava's room with an intensity Clara couldn't ignore. She frowned and checked Ava's monitor. Everything seemed fine but Milo. Wind again, this time pawing lightly at the glass door. Not frantic, just insistent. Clara hesitated, then walked back into Ava's room and stood quietly for a moment. That's when she noticed Ava's breathing. It was just a little more shallow than before, a little too quiet. Clara moved closer, checked her pulse, and saw it was slightly weaker than it should be. Her instincts told her to act quickly. She called another nurse, adjusted Ava's oxygen. And within minutes, the danger passed. Clara stepped back out into the hallway and looked at Milo, who had now settled back down, silent again, as if his job was done. That night, Clara couldn't stop thinking about it. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. And it wasn't the last time it would happen. Over the next few days, Clara began quietly keeping track, and every time Ava's vitals dipped, Milo would react first. Sometimes he would stand and stare at the door, sometimes he would whine softly, sometimes he would pace in a slow, nervous circle until someone noticed. Julia started to see it too. She would sit beside Ava's bed, exhausted, half asleep, and hear Milo outside the door and know something was wrong before the monitors even beeped. The other nurses thought it was just chance, just a loyal dog missing his best friend, but Clara knew better. She started telling the doctors, "He knows he's trying to tell us," but they just smiled politely and went back to their charts. But then came the night that changed everything. The night when Ava's condition suddenly worsened, and when Milo did something so unexpected, so deliberate, that no one could deny he was more than just a dog waiting for his girl. That night would be the turning point, the moment when even the nurse who had seen everything in her career would have no explanation. But that's what we'll come to next, because what Milo did that night would leave everyone in that hospital speechless, and it would be the start of a miracle no one could explain, not even the nurse who witnessed it. The next few days in the hospital passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind of rhythm that makes you forget how fragile life can be. Ava's room was always soft and still, the faint hum of the oxygen machine blending with the muted footsteps of nurses. In the hallway, Julia barely left her daughter's side. She sat in the reclining chair by the bed with a blanket draped over her shoulders, staring at the tiny rise and fall of Ava's chest, hoping it would always keep moving. Her phone stayed off most of the time. She didn't want the outside world, not the calls from work, not the well-meaning texts from friends saying things like "stay strong." So there was no strength left, just waiting. And outside, Milo kept his silent vigil, rain or shine. Day or night, people passing by began to notice him. Some hospital staff started bringing him scraps of food or water bowls. One volunteer even knitted a little blanket and placed it on the bench for him, but Milo barely touched any of it. He only perked up when Ava's scent drifted faintly through the doors, as if he was tethered to her in a way no one could see. Sometimes, Julia would ask a nurse for permission to bring Ava in her wheelchair, just to see Milo for a minute. And each time, when that small, pale girl was rolled toward him, Milo's, the entire body would come alive, tail wagging, ears forward, eyes soft with the purest kind of love. Ava would smile faintly and whisper, "Hi, Milo," before dozing off again. It was a bond that didn't need words. But something inside Milo was changing too. Clara, the nurse, began to notice it first. One afternoon, while she was checking Ava's chart, she saw Milo sitting outside. Again, but this time he wasn't calm. His eyes were locked on the hallway, his body rigid like a statue carved out of tension. Clara frowned and glanced at Ava's monitors. Everything was stable. No alarms, no unusual readings. But Milo stood and gave a low, almost imperceptible whine. It was soft, but filled with something Clara couldn't describe. Instinct, maybe, or a warning. She decided to check Ava anyway, and sure enough, the little girl's pulse was slightly irregular. Nothing alarming yet, but enough to make Clara call another nurse to double-check. The other nurse rolled her eyes and said, "She's fine, Clara. Don't read too much into it." But an hour later, Ava's oxygen dipped, and the room filled with urgency as the team rushed in. Clara looked through the door toward Milo, who had gone quiet again, his job done. That night Clara couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the pattern in her head, how Milo always knew before the machines did, how his presence wasn't random but intentional. She thought back to her 20 years of experience, to all the children she had seen come and go. and she couldn't shake the feeling that this dog was more than just a pet. The next morning, she found herself kneeling beside him outside the hospital doors. She gently stroked his head and whispered, "What are you trying to tell us, huh? Boy, what do you see that we can't?" Milo just rested his head against her arm and looked up at her with those deep golden eyes. And for a moment Clara felt something she couldn't explain, quiet understanding that passed between them without a single sound. Inside the hospital, Ava drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Sometimes she would mumble a word or two about home, about the garden she used to play in, about picking flowers with Milo. And Julia would hold her hand and whisper, "We'll go home soon, sweetheart." Even though she didn't know if that was true, flashbacks filled Julia's mind. She remembered the day they first brought Milo home. Ava was barely a toddler, shy around most people. But when Milo trotted into the living room, she laughed, a full, bright laugh that echoed off the walls. She reached out her tiny hand and touched his fur. And Milo sat down beside her like he had been waiting for her all along, from that day forward. They were inseparable, every scraped knee, every nightmare. Every lonely afternoon Milo was there. He slept at the foot of her bed, watched over her while she played in the yard, and followed her to the door every morning before preschool. And now, as Julia looked at him through the hospital window, she saw that same fierce loyalty burning in his eyes, as if he was saying, "I'm not leaving her." 2 more days passed like this, and each time Ava had a dip in her vitals, Milo gave a sign before anyone noticed, sometimes a whimper, sometimes a soft bark. Sometimes just standing rigidly at the door, Clara began quietly timing it, and it was never wrong. She even told one of the doctors, Dr. Reynolds, a serious man who didn't have much patience for anything that sounded unscientific. He gave a polite smile and said, "Dogs are intuitive, but machines don't lie." Clara wanted to argue, but she didn't, until the night that would force everyone to see what she saw. It was late, long after visiting hours. The sky outside was dark and heavy with rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The hospital felt eerily quiet. Julia had finally fallen asleep in the chair beside Ava's bed. Exhausted after days without proper rest, Clara was doing her rounds, checking for drips and monitors, when she heard it, louder this time, a sharp, desperate bark echoing from the hallway. She rushed to the window and saw Milo, no longer calm. He was pulling against his leash, pawing at the door with frantic energy. Barking again and again. Clara's heart jumped. She ran into Ava's room and froze. Ava's chest was barely moving, her tiny lips pale, her pulse faint on the monitor. Clara hit the emergency button and shouted for help. Nurses and a doctor rushed in, working quickly to stabilize her. Julia woke to the commotion and gasped in terror, clutching her daughter's hand. Outside, Milo kept barking, his body slamming lightly against the door, as if he couldn't understand why no one was letting him in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ava's vitals steadied, the crisis passed. The room went quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitor. Clara stepped out into the hallway and looked at Milo, soaked from the rain but still standing. Still watching, and she whispered, "You saved her, didn't you?" The other nurses exchanged uneasy glances, and even Dr. Reynolds, who had rushed in during the emergency, paused at the window to look at the dog, his usual stern expression softened for just a moment. But what happened the next evening would go even further, because Milo didn't just warn them this time. He did something that made everyone in that hospital stop in their tracks. Something so deliberate that no one could explain it away. Not even the doctor who believed only in science. And from that moment on, no one would ever look at Milo the same again. Would you believe there are moments in life where silence feels louder than any sound? Where stillness carries the weight of an entire lifetime of waiting? The next evening was exactly that kind of moment. The hospital lights dimmed to their soft nighttime glow, the kind that casts long shadows on the polished floors. And the rain that had poured all day finally stopped, leaving the streets outside glossy and quiet. Inside Ava's room, Julia sat reading a worn-out storybook softly to her daughter. Her voice low and trembling from exhaustion, Ava's eyelids fluttered, half open, half closed, her small hand resting Limply on the bedspread, Julia tried to stay strong, but every word she read felt like a plea, silent bargain with the universe that her daughter would hold on just a little longer. Down the hallway, Nurse Clara was making her rounds again. She'd been watching Milo closely these past few days. Unable to shake the feeling that his behavior was more than coincidence, she'd even kept a notebook tucked in her pocket with times and notes about every reaction he had to Ava's condition. The other nurses teased her gently, calling it Clara's dog diary, but she didn't mind. Because deep down she knew something extraordinary was happening. Milo wasn't just sensing Ava's changes, he was responding like he understood them. And tonight, as Clara walked past the glass door leading to the hospital courtyard, she froze. Milo wasn't on the bench like usual. He was standing, alert, his ears pricked, his tail stiff, his eyes fixed intently on the building, and then he did something she'd never seen before. He bolted, darting around to the back entrance, barking sharply, urgently, the sound echoing off the empty streets. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the clock, then down the hall toward Ava's room, unease curling in her chest. She hurried to the room and peered inside. Ava was lying quietly, Julia still reading softly. Everything looked the same, but as Clara stepped closer, she noticed something. Ava's breathing was faint, and there was a strange stillness in her face that hadn't been there minutes before. Clara immediately moved toward the monitor, her trained eyes catching a subtle but dangerous drop in oxygen saturation. She called out for the doctor, pressing the emergency button again. The room came alive with movement. Julia gasped, clutching Ava's hand, whispering, "Please, please stay with me," as the medical team moved quickly. But here's where everything changed outside. Milo didn't just bark this time. He raced to the side door, pushing his body against it, pawing at it with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. A security guard who had been making rounds noticed the commotion and opened the door slightly. Milo squeezed through before the man could stop him, sprinting down the hallway like he knew exactly where to go. People turned in surprise as the dog, soaked from the evening dew, ran straight toward Ava's room, barking in a sharp, rhythmic way, not random, not panicked, but purposeful, like he was commanding attention. Clara glanced up as Milo skidded to a stop at the doorway. His eyes wide, locked on Ava, and in that instant, Julia's gaze met Milo's, and she felt something deep, unspoken pass. Between them, a plea, a promise. Milo stepped inside, slowly. Ignoring the chaos of nurses moving around the bed, he nudged his way past them, coming to stand right beside Ava, his nose brushing her arm gently. His body trembling with quiet urgency, and then something incredible happened. Ava, who had been slipping deeper into unconsciousness, stirred ever so slightly at the touch of Milo's fur. Her fingers twitched, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Julia to see. She gasped, "Milo, keep touching her." Clara, without hesitation, nodded to the team to pause for a moment. To let the dog stay, the room fell still, except for the soft beeping of monitors. Milo lowered himself carefully onto the edge of the bed, his head resting lightly on Ava's chest, his breathing slow and steady and miraculously, as if in response. Ava's shallow breaths began to match his rhythm, faint but there. The monitor, which had been dipping dangerously, started to stabilize. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Even Dr. Reynolds, stoic physician who never believed in anything beyond science, stood frozen. Watching the small girl's vitals improve in sync with the dog's calm presence, Julia covered her mouth, tears streaming. Silently, whispering, "You're saving her, Milo," over and over. No one moved for several long minutes, afraid to break whatever invisible connection was happening. And when Ava's breathing finally evened out, Clara let out the breath she'd been holding, whispering, I don't know how, but he knew, after the crisis passed. Milo stayed curled up beside Ava for hours, refusing to leave. The staff allowed it, breaking every hospital rule, because deep down they all knew this wasn't just a dog lying by a child's side. This was something more. The next day, news of what had happened quietly spread through the hospital. Staff members whispered about the dog who had sensed what machines couldn't, about the moment when he had run inside like he was answering a call only he could hear. Even visitors in the waiting room started coming to the window to catch a glimpse of him. But Milo didn't care about any of that. His entire world was in that room, and everyone who saw him knew it. Later that evening, Clara found herself sitting beside Julia in the hallway. They both watched Ava sleep peacefully with Milo beside her. "I've been a nurse for 20 years, Clara said softly, "and I've never seen anything like this. Dogs can sense a lot, but this is different," Julia nodded silently. Too overwhelmed to speak, in that moment, she remembered a day long before Ava got sick. A stormy afternoon when she had been late coming home from work. Ava had been frightened by the thunder, and when Julia finally opened the door, she found her daughter curled up in the living room with Milo wrapped around her like a living shield. He had been there then, and he was here now, never wavering. But what none of them could know was that the real turning point hadn't come yet. That Milo's greatest act was still ahead, because the very next night, just when it seemed Ava had stabilized, something unexpected would happen, something that would make even the most skeptical doctors believe. Something so extraordinary it would change the way everyone looked at this quiet, loyal dog forever. Would you believe that sometimes the smallest flicker of hope can arrive in the quietest moments when no one expects it? 2 nights later, the hospital was still. The hum of machines echoing faintly down the corridors. Most of the rooms were dimly lit, and the soft rhythm of rain tapping against the windows created a calm lull. Ava had been holding steady since Milo's sudden heroic reaction. Her breathing was shallow but even. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, telling Julia that the next 48 hours would be crucial. Julia sat by Ava's bedside holding her tiny hand, her thumb lightly brushing against Ava's soft skin as if memorizing the feeling. Milo lay curled at Ava's feet, his head resting gently on the edge of the bed, his eyes never straying from her face. He hadn't left the room once, even when the nurses tried to coax him out for food or water. It was as though he knew his presence was needed more than anything else. That night, Nurse Clara was on duty again. And she'd gotten into the habit of checking on Ava more than the others, partly because of her concern for the little girl, but also because she couldn't shake her fascination with Milo. She kept telling herself there had to be a logical explanation. Some subtle changes he could sense in Ava's body that humans couldn't. But deep down she knew it went beyond science. It was something unspoken, something rare. It was just past midnight when the room fell into an unusual stillness. Julia had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, her head leaning against her arm. The monitors beeped softly, a gentle lullaby of reassurance, but Milo suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching, as if catching a sound too faint for human ears. He stood slowly, his muscles tense, and his eyes fixed on Ava, with an intensity that made Clara's heart race. He moved closer to Ava's face and nudged her lightly, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Clara, who had just stepped into the room to check vitals, froze at the doorway. Milo. She whispered, but he didn't look at her. His focus remained entirely on Ava. And then the monitor let out a sharp, warning tone. Ava's oxygen levels dropped suddenly, faster than they had before. The alarm began to sound, echoing down the hallway. Julia woke up instantly, panic flooding her face as she cried out, "What's happening?" The room erupted into motion as Clara rushed to the bedside, calling for the emergency team. But before anyone could move further, Milo did something no one could explain. He placed his paw gently on Ava's chest, pressing lightly but firmly. And then he let out a long, low howl that sent chills through everyone in the room. It wasn't a howl of fear or aggression. It was deep, mournful, almost pleading. And then he moved closer, resting his head fully on her tiny chest, his breathing becoming slow and steady. A perfect rhythm, and somehow Ava's chest began to rise and fall again, faintly at first, but then more steadily. The monitor, which had been alarming, started to stabilize, the red warning lights fading back into soft green. Clara stared in disbelief, her hands frozen mid-motion. Julia covered her mouth with trembling fingers, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "He's keeping her here. He's holding her here." The doctors rushed in moments later, but when they saw the monitor returning to normal and Milo pressed gently against Ava, they paused, one of them, Dr. Reynolds, who had always insisted on hard facts, muttered under his breath, "I've never seen anything like this." The team still administered oxygen support, running through the necessary protocols. But even they couldn't deny that something about Milo's touch had triggered a change. When the crisis passed, Milo didn't move. He stayed there, his head on Ava's chest, his paw resting over her tiny hand. The room was silent, except for the quiet sobs of Julia, who whispered thank you over and over again in the days that followed. Something even more miraculous happened. Ava began to wake slowly at first, opening her eyes for brief moments. The first time she looked around, her gaze immediately found Milo. Her lips parted slightly, and though no sound came out, a faint smile appeared. It was the first sign of life they'd seen in weeks. Julia cried openly, hugging Milo, pressing her forehead against his fur, whispering, "You saved her. You really saved her," as days turned into weeks. Ava regained strength bit by bit. The doctors couldn't explain it. They called it spontaneous recovery and used all kinds of medical terms. But everyone who had been there that night knew the truth. It wasn't spontaneous. It was Milo. Always Milo. Even when Ava was strong enough to sit up and smile, Milo never left her side. He followed her during physical therapy sessions, lying quietly as she relearned how to walk down the hospital hallway. He was there when she took her first steps outside again, holding Julia's hand with sunlight warming her face. The entire hospital staff gathered that day, watching the moment with teary eyes. Nurse Clara knelt down and scratched Milo's ears, whispering, "You're the real doctor here, aren't you?" News of the story spread beyond the hospital. First among staff, then patients, and soon the local news picked it up. People came by just to catch a glimpse of the dog who had done what no machine could. They called Milo a miracle, a guardian angel, but Julia simply called him family. Months later, when Ava was fully discharged, the hospital held a small ceremony. They presented Milo with a medal of recognition, a simple token, but one that carried immense meaning. Ava, now stronger, hugged him tightly and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me go." And in that moment, every person watching felt the truth settle deep in their hearts. Dogs don't just love us. They see us, they hear us, even in the silence where no one else can. They hold on when we're too weak to hold on ourselves. And as Julia carried her daughter out of the hospital, Milo walking proudly beside them, everyone there knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Something no science could explain, but everyone could feel. And now, I want to ask you, do you believe dogs can sense the things we cannot? Would your dog do the same for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart even a little, share it with someone who needs to believe and hope today. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles come with 4 paws and a heartbeat that never gives up.